This is a mappa mundi, so the relationship of these images and the places that they're from are cartographically correct if Brisbane were the centre of the world. So it can be shifted so that, because the exhibition travels to Germany and to the United States, and in each place it is similarly shifted and rotated so that they are where we are now, at the centre of things. The only thing that remains to the photograph as an index, which would be its exact relationship. So in the story of Borges of the cartographers, where they elaborate a map the size of the place in which they're endeavouring to represent, so it is with these images. They are in this exhibition in exactly the same size that they are in the place by photograph. It's very difficult to characterise what exactly Thomas Friedman does. I suppose he's a cultural theorist, as well as a senior columnist for the New York Times. And so The World is Flat proceeds from the assumption that those indexes that underpinned the ascendancy of the West, the ability to measure and shape temporal and spatial indexes, the clock, navigation, those things that proceeded from that, all of these have gone from human exchanges. It is effectively the same time everywhere in the world now. If we look at this concept of the flat world, the last time in the popular imagination that it was flat was in the late medieval period. And we are in effect approaching economic systems, again, that are neo-feudal in their construction. Transnational corporations behave increasingly as though they are sovereign. And so I'm very interested in that sort of, that evacuated space that is concurrent in both medieval image making, but also the way, for example, it's also present in the classical traditions of East Asia. And one of the really fortunate things about the location of Australia now is this relationship to Asia that we have. These positions are really interesting for artists, particularly, for example, if you wanted to critique capital, value that is opaque, both in art and in the stock market. Ever since the global financial crisis, I'm really nervous around the theorization, particularly in art, possesses elements that remind me very much of doctrine. They require faith. Really, you have to believe. I'm of the generation, probably the last generation, for whom a functioning belief in God was commonplace. So when I lost that belief, that catalytic moment has remained to me, and I'm very aware that particularly conceptual and process-based positions are very strongly aligned with the way in which value is generated in capital, and I think we need to be aware of that and to acknowledge it. Art and life proceed from the same elemental processes, and the elements and the attributes that you find in life, you find also in art. I've tried to construct my work as a modest critique of this, in that those things that for me are terrifically important are memory, of course, the understanding that postmodernity this is not the first time we have had these frameworks of concurrent stylistic and formal propositions. The end of the 19th century was very much also internationally linked. One of the Boyer lectures by David Malouf, I think perhaps the end of the last century, he spoke of the international links that used to exist. Mr. Malouf is now quite senior. So he would be thinking then of the 19th century when we did have effectively a borderless world. Passports were not yet established as a means of regulating travel. So amnesia plays an incredibly important role in the generation of art. And I think there's an essay by T.S. Eliot, Tradition and the Individual Talent, in which he argues a terribly important role that memory has for an artist, particularly an artist over, let's say, 25 or 30, where they need to understand that their work will go out and enter a continuum of cultural production that is millennia old. And you need a memory that extends past last Thursday. So I've tried very much in a modest way to reference some of those things, particularly to evidence a great respect for labour, for the hand, for those things that are durational. Durational performance, for example, that type of 21 or 22 hours is really nothing compared to the time in which it takes me to generate one of these images. They're months of work, and I take a modest measure of glee in that none of that effort is visible, that it looks seamless, and that embedded in it is a critique of both the world and the art world. And it's fetishization of particular forms of cultural production and consumption. There's an interesting element of there's a conflation of possibilities in post-colonial discourse, but also in post-camera and post-photographic theory. The colony and the photograph are both acts of representation that have, like the garden, a relationship to the real. The real in the sense of the construction of Australia around an image of Britain, the relationship that the photograph has, the object of the photograph has to its subject as evidence, and the relationship between the garden as a form of similitude with regards to nature. So I think that, you mentioned before interdisciplinary modes of working, I think that it's also necessary to take a turn from nature, to cross-pollinate, particularly theoretical positions, and to be a little promiscuous with regards to what sort of children theory might produce. So I've been able to, what has interested me a lot is how, firstly, a lot of post-colonial theories has to be retooled for Australia. I mean, we resemble the oppressor, if you understand what I mean. Our situation, although materially not different to that of Africa or Malaysia, it's very difficult, I suppose, for us to see that we have a greater commonality with these places than we have with Europe or North America. This interests me, that relationship between the real and the unreal. And I particularly like the concept of unreal estate. You know, what is the value of these things? It's also arbitrary. And the slippage between cultural and material value is something we need to be aware of. And we need to be aware that exactly the same forces that inflate the value of property and also inflate the cultural value of art. It's very, very hard to articulate an effective and focused social critique outside the obvious. And I think obvious frontal strategies, well, they don't work in other forms of struggle. So they're unlikely to be effective for artists in the longer term. I believe that art's use of terms like subversive need to be exposed to a little bit more scrutiny, because subversion is not overt. Subversion is very subtle. It is almost a viral activity within the cultural mechanism, which is, I think I've effectively infected photography with other positions. And for example, the model of Dr. Moreau, if taken outside his island laboratory and applied to other forms of the transplantation of one element into that of another as a host, is an interesting proposition for artists to consider. I said, in one sense, because nature is very much a cultural construction, architecture has a relationship similarly to nature. But there is in Sydney an astonishing experience. You walk down, do you know Hyde Park, the spires of St Mary's Cathedral? You see this link between nature and architecture in a vivid way, where that the avenue of Moreton Bay Figs constructs a perfect Gothic nave, and then you look across, and to your right is this echo in architecture. But architecture is an incredible site for artists to engage in a transdisciplinary discourse, particularly in our time. Artists and architects, maybe for the first time in 150 years, are working with common tools. I mean, CAD and these forms of digital processes enable architects and artists to work concurrently towards the same outcome. And those sorts of arguments that were once elaborated around the impossibility of this, cost primarily, and of course then a discourse around function, most of these are either redundant or no longer really valid. So the process of digital sampling can also be taken beyond the way in which they function as a working process to the mashing together of images. And so this questions firstly the authenticity of the idea of place, because place has no anchor any longer. It's, if you like, decoupled from the historical constraints of geography. And my work tries to engage with that in a playful but rigorously. I take some joy that not only is the considerable effort that these images require to be realised invisible when you look at them, but similarly invisible are the slippages between places that happen within the image. The term dragurta, which was confabulated by my friend Rafa from Ulslaw, the R in is added to daguerreotype to make draguerotype is a sort of parasite on it, succubus if you like. But I still never, they are unique works, so monostates, so there's just one. So they endeavour to cohabit concurrently some of that space while resisting, because they can be reproduced endlessly. It's just I choose not to. And it's not to inflate its material value, but rather the daguerreotype was a unique state work, and I'm held hostage by my respect for that. I'm very interested in strategies that enable artists to contest the framework of aura. So that said, I also like conceptual rigour, and so it's very, very difficult to cleave philosophy and its implications from the circumstances of its time. So with Benjamin and Aura, it was really about the precision of the image, I think, and how resolved it was, and that the mechanically reproduced image did not have the crispness, the verisimilitude, the sharp focus of the original. This is no longer the case. So aura is a contentious notion, particularly from a theoretical point of view. They require, I suppose, they try to insist, but the way a child insists, which is with stamping of feet and holding of breath and that look, because they can pass for a lot of things. And passing is a very, very interesting concept in its relationship to, firstly, to similitude, but because of its destabilization of power, its potential to, and how you can slip backwards and forwards with passing. So these pass for a range of things, and it's that slippery categorization that requires that. It's like flypaper for the eye. You look and you're stuck there engaged in a pursuit of the surface, and the surface, it's just a series of surfaces, which of course is a contradiction, but they have some of the spatial indexes, so that way in which space is inferred and constructed optically, but they're disobedient. They are a mirror in which the reflection is no longer corresponds to the person regarding themselves in it, so it's a disobedient mirror. It's very difficult for a work to be disobedient, but certainly something like the Lao Kun cut from floral wallpaper contests both the homoeroticism of the original image and that of muscular violence, but it remains identifiable. You know exactly what it is, and this is something that I've not lost, that I've not surrendered to, the idea that it does remain possible to make work that is troubling, but not immediately. It is the difference between a cold and a flu. You know that where you're infected and then you don't know it at the time, whereas a lot of stuff just functions like a cold. You catch it immediately and you know, and then it passes. So there is a persistence in the memory, I hope, of some of these images. I have an interest in atrophied artisanal techniques, intarsia and pietra-dura, and both of them have a relationship to painting. So this interests me a great deal. Also, what interests me is that that they were at their time virtuoso displays of technique and technology, the cutting of stone, the inlay of wood, the development of industries around those processes, particularly, for example, with pietra-dura. You could send a painting off to the Optifio della Pietra-dura in Florence, and several years later you would receive back this image rendered in stone. So it very much is linked, if you like, it's a proto-modern mode of cultural production, but both of them have ended rather nastily as extruded over cheap furniture, and this I like particularly the collapse of what was a really aristocratic and extraordinarily expensive and refined position into mass production. The way in which these extraordinary images were broken up and reassembled and then often 2 or 3 times dislocated from their framing context and reassembled into different narratives makes them not only proto but proto-modern in how they function. I like them because they have a tremendous respect for the value of labour. We are very, very privileged to have close to us antique cultures with tremendous authenticity and continuity. Firstly, what we can learn from Indigenous Australians. I don't mean what we can take from the physical appearance of their work, that type of parasitic postmodernist idea that you can simply lift from others, but certainly in their relationship to, particularly how a number of Indigenous artists just contest the authority of whiteness. But we can also learn around the real value of land and place and country. We can also take from, by extension, from Asia a range of other positions, particularly, again, I don't mean to lift, to appropriate their formal and stylistic properties, the resonance between the multi-point perspective in classical Chinese art and the way in which it functioned in Western art before the Renaissance is very, very interesting. But of course also in science fiction, the way in which in Stargate it's used to navigate the universe. It makes, it requires of us that it's again the distinction between looking and seeing. We have to see what their work means and how it functions, and not just simply what it looks like. This is an egregious mistake that a lot of Western artists, when appropriating, and appropriation is a hostage discourse really, and I would like to imagine that what I've elaborated here is this sort of liberationist theory around modes of cultural production that can be highly politicized, but without being evidently so. That the voice, if you like, that the work speaks with is soft and sonorous, like that of the hypnotist in the work of Superflex next door.